He cares deeply about this city, but also about the ideas. And I introduced him as a financier and a philanthropist, but he's also a thought leader. He is someone that brings people from around the world, some 3,000 world leaders from 60 nations to Los Angeles every year with the Milken Institute Global Conference. Esquire magazine called him one of the most influential people of the 21st century. And I know he's here somewhere. Did he leave me? There he is. One of the most influential people of the 21st century. Began supporting education and medical research in the 1970s. He formalized his philanthropy in 1982 by establishing the Milken Family Foundation. Fortune magazine called him the man who changed medicine for his 35 years of progress against life-threatening diseases, an effort that saved thousands of lives. He has done a great deal since his work as a financier and promoting the growth of some 3,200 companies that have created millions of jobs. His recent article, Where's Sputnik?, looks at 6 major challenges to America and proposes solutions that can lead to a national renewal. You can read that and a lot more about him in MikeMilken.com, but for now, please join me in welcoming our city's treasurer and my good friend, Mike Milken.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'm sorry for the group here, but I'm actually standing behind you. And so we're going to show a number of slides, and I wanted to just deliver a couple themes to you today. And the first one, overriding theme, is what role is America going to play in the 21st century? We could ask the question, really, why is it important what role America plays in the 21st century? And I would suggest to you that it is an important role. The United States has been a leader economically, politically, has been a role model in many ways for the world. If we want to go back and take a look at today, this is the way the world's market looks today, with the United States at about 23.6% of the world's economy, China now at 8.7%. If you look at projections made by the Milken Institute and others around the world, this is the way the world's going to look around the middle of the 21st century, where the United States is the second largest economy in the world, China is the largest economy in the world, India is the third, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on, with Mexico moving up to the 7th largest economy in the world. So from an economic standpoint, that might not be a surprise to any of us today because these things are pretty widely known. But if we step back a couple hundred years and say, what did the world look like a couple hundred years ago? You'll see that the United States had 1.8% of the world's economy. So the real story for the world in the last 200 years has been the United States, going from what was 1.8% of the world's economy to peaking at 40% of the world's economy, and now at 23. And the question is on its way someday here, we think, to about 16. And so the question is, what role is the United States going to play? And the issue of leadership, the issue of certainty, the issue of job creation, all these things are key that you have discussed so far today. Now, the largest economy in the world that's moving in that direction is China. They have much different issues than the United States. So if we look at China, part of their effort is moving of people. In 1800 in the United States, more than 90% of the people worked in agriculture. By 1900, it was down to 40 to 45%, and today it's 1%. So if you think about China, they have the equivalent of half of France move every year. So if you're thinking about movement in your city and housing in your city, new schools, etc., this is a country where the equivalent of half of the people in France move every year. So every 2 years, you have movement from rural parts of China to urban parts of China during this period of time. And so you can imagine, as a leader of this country, they're so concerned with stability, with the fact that still the majority of their people have not moved in to where we are even at the end of the 20th century. And how are they going to be able to move them across? This movement to urban areas, if we think about the way it was just 100 years ago, really it was England was the only country in the entire world where more than 50% of the people lived in an urban area. The only country in the entire world. So it was 100 years ago, essentially, that people lived in rural areas. Today, if we take a look by 2000, you can see most of the countries in the world, as you're fully aware, where jobs have been created, where growth has occurred in cities. So the world as we know it today doesn't really mirror anything that it looked like 100 years ago. And so as we're dealing with these issues, we need to understand in many ways the moral importance of the United States at this time in history to the world, and why, even if you're not a citizen of the United States, why it is important what role the United States is going to play. And so the question is, can the 21st century be a century that has significant American influence in the world today? And what are the requirements for us to succeed? And I want to take a look at it maybe in 4 ways. 1, perception versus reality. 2, the democratization of capital. 3, building human capital. And 4, where's Sputnik, the piece you have with you. So real estate prices collapsed. Credit dried up. Home building stopped. Now, this is not a headline that at first occurred in 2008 in America. This is a headline that first appeared in what is called the Wall Street Journal today in 1792, as George Washington was President of the United States. Stock markets dropped 50%. Banks curtail lending. Commentators predict widespread bankruptcy, high unemployment, volatile interest rates. This is not 2008. These were the headlines in 1974. Probably the most important economic period and financial period, if you want to study in the United States, that occurred in the last 60 to 70 years. To give you an analysis, we are kind of rerunning this period of time. This is a look at the stock market from 1973 to 1976, overlaid with the stock market from 2008, 2011, and you can see the enormous similarities that occurred during this period of time. What is the most valuable real estate? You've come here to Los Angeles. We have the mayor of Beverly Hills with you today. Each one of these 6 cities, at some time in the past decade, claimed they had the most valuable real estate in the world. If we continue to believe that this is among the most valuable real estate in the world, and your own strategies as running your cities believe this, we are destined for serious problems. None of these are anywhere close to being the most valuable real estate in the world. The most valuable real estate in the world today generally ends with something that says .com. Every single person in the world can go there. They can look at it, they can buy your goods, they can buy your merchandise, they can share information. And this is the most valuable real estate in the world. Now, can we think of a vivid example that makes this come true? Let's just go back less than a decade ago. There were 2 companies, one called Netflix that got started, and the largest company in the world in its area called Blockbuster. Most of you had Blockbuster stores in your neighborhoods. Netflix felt that having all these stores was a liability, and ultimately they would distribute first through the mail, but distribute through the mail instead of physically. No one felt they could compete with Blockbuster. They had more stores than anyone, they bought more product than anyone, they had better pricing than anyone, they had more knowledge and data than anyone. And if we go back a decade, it took 28 Netflix to make one Blockbuster. Well, let's see what's happened 10 years later. Blockbuster is now worth $0. And Netflix is now worth $15 billion. The idea that your business, that people can come to you and you can communicate with them in certain businesses without having a physical relationship, this idea. Now, what have we learned from this experience? Here's a look at 1976. This is a computer that I wheeled onto my trading floor in 1976. And to give you a measure of data storage, it cost $1 million per megabyte to store at that computer. That supercomputer that we merged at that time. Now today, we can all get our little iPods out. Today, it costs approximately 0.002 of a cent per megabyte. What is the message here? If you believe data storage is going to zero, which effectively it has, you can store all the information, all the videos, everything that was created digitally at little to no cost. Second, when I wanted to talk to my office in India in 1975, it cost me $10 a minute. $10 a minute to talk to India. Well, you can't really have a transfer of labor at $600 an hour. Today, it now costs 1 cent a minute. So I can talk to anyone in the world for little to no cost, transmit any information anywhere in the world for little to no cost, and I can store all the information the world's ever created for little to no cost. So if you're not factoring these things into where you're going, etc. There was a company called AT&T at one time, among the largest companies in the world, still is, in a different form. They invented cellular technology. I was financing this because I had seen Star Trek and already heard Captain Kirk tell Scotty to beam him up. So who would want to have a telephone hooked into a wall if you could have one that went with you? Well, AT&T analyzed the market, they invented this technology, and they concluded that by the year 2000, there would be 1 million users in the world. $1,000 a year, 1 million users, $1 billion worldwide market. It was not big enough for them, so they decided not to go into the cellular business in the 1980s because the market was too small. Well, let's see how they did. Well, there's only 5 billion cell phones in the world. So their estimate that there was going to be 1 million of them was a little low. And as a result, they've been playing catch-up ever since. And I want to show you one little picture taken from a developing country of what the world looks like here today. So you don't have to have a lot of infrastructure. And that little hut with one little cell, solar cell on top, without even a power plant, can start to propel. So as you're thinking about where the world's going to be in your cities, if you're focusing on areas and the realization that you can go anywhere in the world at little to no cost and access any information, you need to figure out where the jobs are going to be created in a competitive world. The democratization of capital. It was almost 25 years ago when I addressed the Conference of Mayors and pointed out at that time that 95% of all the cities' pension funds, savings funds, etc., could not invest in a non-investment grade company. They only could buy investment grade debt. There's only 500 companies in the United States. You could not invest in one company headed by an African American. You could not invest in one company headed by a woman at the time. Not one company headed by Hispanic and Latinos, no matter what changed in terms of political power. The regulations said you could not loan money to people that were creating jobs. Now, for me, I was at Berkeley, where 1964, where the first of the baby boomers went to college, and of course, we couldn't understand why the administration was running the school newspaper, et cetera, et cetera. But it was really returning almost to this spot, almost to where we are in 1965, that for me changed my world, and has changed the world since for many others. And the Watts riots began here, August 11th, 1965, right near where you are, and Los Angeles was on fire. You didn't need to go to Vietnam. There were armed personnel carriers on the streets, and it was hard to really understand why was Los Angeles on fire. All the entertainment companies were here, all the dreams were here. It wasn't an eastern city with heavy discrimination or segregation. And I met a young African-American man that night who told me that he wasn't part of the American dream. His father didn't have access to capital. He would never have access to capital. Now the factory he worked in burned down. He had no job. He didn't do anything to stop it. It seemed irrational to me, but when I listened to your press conference today, it brought me right back to this formula I wrote down in 1965. Prosperity. What is prosperity? It needs access to financial capital, which served as a multiplier effect on human capital, the greatest asset, social capital, the next important asset, and lastly, real assets that you think about. But if we don't have any access to financial capital, there's no multiplier effect. And so here was a talented young man who had given up and watched the building he worked in burn down because he felt he was never going to be part of the American dream. And so prosperity, we could substitute that word for jobs and job creation and personal confidence and pride in yourself. And the promise of America is that you have a chance based on your ability, not your race or where you went to college or who your parents were, but the promise of America, not just to Americans, but to the entire world today, which is why everyone still wants to come to America, is you have a chance to succeed based on your ability, not who your parents were or where you went to school or your religion or your race. And that was the promise of America. If we looked at what happened during this period of time, there were 62 million jobs created in the private sector by non-investment grade companies, minus 4 million jobs created by big companies over a 30-year period of time. So I just want to suggest to you, if you're thinking that large companies are going to create jobs and drive your cities, you are not going in the right direction. Okay, it's the new ideas, it's the small businesses. Los Angeles has lost most of the large companies that used to headquarter here, not too far from where we were, Arco, Unical, etc., Lockheed. But it's the center of small and medium business for the world. That's the group that creates jobs. Over 50% of the US GDP, 99.7% of all the employers, 50% of all the private sector workers, 2.2 trillion in payroll. The key is, how do you attract young entrepreneurs? How do you attract people with ability to your city and give them the opportunities to grow? This has gone on for hundreds of years. As GE grew, the number of employees reduced. Large companies substitute financial capital, machines, and other types of mechanisms for workers. Small companies create jobs. And so you all know that, you all hear that, but this is just a quick look, and you can see what happened in America, why I cite this period of 74 and 5, and why it was so important once we provided capital to these businesses. Ms. Goodman's city here, every time we provided capital to one of those businesses, those were job machines, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 jobs created in one building with just as many jobs supporting them in the community. But if you don't have a mechanism that says this is a place where you can grow and create capital, it's not going to happen in your city. The mission of the Milken Institute has been to improve the lives by advancing economic, innovative things, but access to capital and health care. Why do they want to live in your city versus some other city? And that's been our goal. There's many things, and we gave you a few on job creation to look at, and we've done many things for many of your cities over a period of time. What is this idea of building human capital? When Boeing announced it was leaving Seattle, a company which I had financed, people thought, well, this could be the end of the world, Boeing leaving Seattle. But if you say what is the driving force in Seattle today, it has not been Boeing. It's been the fact that Craig McCaw grew up there and Bill Gates grew up there, and we saw the explosion in cellular industry, the explosion in computer software, which created tens of thousands of millionaires who, in a sense, got involved with community programs, education programs, and they, over time, iterated thousands of other firms that were created. This is a look at the balance sheet at the end of last year for households in America. It says that households had $21 trillion in assets. And you'll see here that securities is the largest share of their assets. For 90% of all the years in the last 100 years, the number one asset was real estate. And why do we hear so much about the value of homes and things? Because so much of the net worth, particularly of middle-class America, was in this little red area, real estate. But a person won a Nobel Prize who's been very involved with our institute, and a person I've followed since '65, Gary Becker, when he said that that is not the balance sheet of America, nor your city, nor a company. And the real competition in the 20th century and the 21st century is for human capital. And that is the major asset, and it makes up 75% of the value of your city. You might not feel it. You get one person to move your city, it can change your city. Almost 25 years ago, we started this program called University Community Outreach in Philadelphia. Only 5% of the students that went to Wharton stayed in Philadelphia upon graduation. Imagine this, you're bringing 800 or 1,000 of the most talented people from all over the world to your city, and 950 of them leave. Imagine what you could have done in that city had you co-opted them the day they arrived in your city. So those universities are key. Many of the reasons they come to your city is because of the university in that city. Can you get them involved in your city, whether it's with high school, middle school kids? Let's take an example that we can all easily identify today. A young man named Steve Jobs. He said many years ago, innovation has nothing to do with your R&D dollars, how much money you're spending. IBM was spending 100 times what he was spending. It's how you lead the people and who the people are. So let's just look at a case study here for a moment. Let's go back to the day that Steve Jobs was allowed to return to the company he founded, Apple. If you remember, he was asked to leave his company because he was too innovative, and they had to bring in a professional manager from PepsiCo. So this is Apple. It was worth $1.65 billion. Sony was worth $34 billion. The founder of Sony, Morita, had passed away. Sony had everything going for it. Every one of us who bought a Sony product paid 20% more than the other person because they were the best. They had the best industrial design, they had the coolest this, they had launched the little thing you ran around with when you ran, etc. They had 2 movie studios and one of the world's leading record studios. And it took 20 Apples to make one Sony. So Sony had everything, and IBM had to give money to Apple, invest money in Apple, not IBM, excuse me, Microsoft, because they were under an antitrust attack, and they were concerned if they had no competitor, what the difficulties would be with antitrust. So they invested more than $100 million in Apple so Apple wouldn't go bankrupt. Well, let's look at it 14 years later. Apple today is the second most valuable company in the world. The second most valuable company in the world. They did not raise any money. They didn't buy any companies. This one individual came back. That was the only real change. You would have made 200 times your money if you invested in Apple. And today it takes 13 Sonys to make one Apple. One person. And what I want to try to really enforce today is try to identify whether it's one, whether it's five, whether it's 10, who are those individuals that have the capability of building an organization that will not only change the world in terms of its business and create jobs, but change your city at the same time. Does this idea work for a country or a city, or does it just work for a company? Let's take a look at one. This is Singapore, 1960. Singapore and Jamaica both separated from the UK, from England at the same time. They had about the same number of people, the same weather, highly humid, and the same per capita income. And Lee Kuan Yew went to visit Jamaica and talk to the new leader in Jamaica to discuss what was his strategy going to be, and what was his strategy now that they were both no longer going to be part of the UK and England, but separate, independent countries. 1960. Jamaica chose the track of tourism and natural resources for its strategy. Singapore chose the track of human capital, trying to attract the world's best and brightest to Singapore and investing their money in the education of their citizens, with the idea that in the end, the only thing they had going for them was human capital. This is 1960. And I really want to come back and say to you again today, because the most valuable real estate in the world is .com, and because an increasing percentage of the world's output is going to be digitized and sent anywhere in the world, the real key to your city is who lives there. Who is living in your city? And the value of the real estate in the city will be determined by your education system and other things. You cannot protect real estate values unless you have the people there with talent, because they're the only ones that are going to protect your jobs in the long run. So let's see what happened. So today, per capita income in Singapore is $40,000 per person, and per capita income in Jamaica is $4,800 per person. No one would confuse Jamaica and Singapore today or even associate the two, yet they were the exact same 40 to 50 years ago. Do you need a lot of land? Do you need a lot of area? No. Jamaica has a much larger land mass than Singapore. Singapore is about the size of Lake Tahoe, if you've ever visited Lake Tahoe. Think about in your own cities, if you could create, however Singapore operates, if you set up a section in your own city to operate that way, to try to attract people to that area. There's a lot of things to do, and I just want to encourage you in many ways today to reach out on a philanthropic standpoint. The social activist is just beginning in America. These are some of the activities that we've interacted with many of you on in this area, particularly focused in healthcare, education, and programs in many of your cities. But today, many of people of wealth are focused on social activism in cities and fully understand the importance of creating jobs. How can we help you create jobs? If you haven't created a job, it's pretty hard for a person not to have pride in what they do from that standpoint. Where's Sputnik? America is much different today than it was when Sputnik went up in 1957. And I come back to this, where's Sputnik today? One, it had a major effect on my life, but it was a changing point for the United States of America. The day Sputnik went up in 1957, Soviet Union thought it was their greatest day, that communism had won over democracy, that they had sent something to outer space that was traveling around. And those of you who were around at that time in school, you remember we had duck and cover drills. My 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Friedman, had a problem in that she tried to convince me that if a nuclear bomb hit Hesby Street Elementary School, if I was under my desk, I'd be safe, and if I wasn't under my desk, it could be bad. We eventually reached a compromise that she wouldn't try to convince me and I wouldn't disrupt the class anymore. But that was not the greatest day for the Soviet Union, maybe for an hour. That was the end of the Soviet Union. That was the first day that it was the end of the Soviet Union because it woke up the United States. It was cool to be a math major. It was cool to be a physicist. NASA was formed, DARPA was formed. The idea of investing in technology grew in America. And if you went to places like Lockheed, you would find that 50% of their scientists, physicists, went into that field because of Sputnik. It was a message that was delivered that obviously we had to get going. What about America today? Let's take a look at it today. In 1960, when President Kennedy was winning the election for president, 75% of every single person who was not born in this country, who was in this country, came from Europe. 10% from Canada. So 85% of everyone in America in 1960 who was not born here came either from Canada or Europe. By 2009, 81% of every single person in this country that was not born here came from Asia or Latin America. If we look at California, and you're here today with our great mayor in Los Angeles, but 70% of everything that happens in this country starts in California, both good and bad. Let's take a look at the changing face of California. So this is your change in population. Caucasians, people of European ancestry, actually there are less people of European ancestry at the end of the decade than there were at the beginning. Tremendous growth in people with ancestors from Latin America and tremendous growth from Asia. This unbelievable experiment of the United States. We are probably the only country in the world that's been willing to change its face peacefully. And if you look at these and you look at the growth rates and you project them out, it's not hard before you understand that the majority of people in America, ancestors will have come from Asia or Latin America, and I'm sure by 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050, in our textbooks and elementary schools, we'll be studying the history of Asian countries and Latin American countries a lot more than we do today. And so the question here is, can we extend this American century into the future? My comments to you would be, it's really related to two things. Leadership, which all of you have the awesome responsibility, and personal responsibility of the individual in this country. Let's take a look at these 6 things quickly that you have in front of you. Energy. You might remember 74. In 74, if you had the wrong license plate number, you couldn't even get gas on those days. So you could see, and they limited, you can see here, 10 gallons of gas per customer. A giant wake-up call for America. The most emotional call made by any president was President Carter. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war, except instead of uniting our efforts to destroy, we will build. Here's President Carter giving his plea to the nation. An emotional appeal to the country. Let's look at our last 8 presidents. When President Nixon gave his appeal, the U.S. imported 36%. When President Carter, we were up to 40. When President Reagan, we were at 43.6. When President Clinton, we had just approached 50%. When President Obama, we were at 2/3. So I asked each of you today to just try to think, what would the world have been like had we ever lived up to our commitments? We have spent $7.3 trillion since '74 in the Persian Gulf. Do you think you could have better deployed $7.3 trillion in your cities in America? You think America would be stronger? You think we'd have our best and brightest dying in the Middle East today had we actually lived up to this policy? If the world actually believed the United States would actually live up to what it said it was going to do, the price of oil would go down immediately out of fear that we actually would have executed something. But when they see that 8 presidents have called for this, and it only gets worse, president after president, they don't believe that the United States is going to show leadership in this area. There's a lot of reasons for this, the volatility of price, etc., which we could get into, and we have different solutions. But unless the United States decides that it's going to have energy security and have independence, the rest of the world is not going to be looking for leadership from the United States in this century, and our role in this century is going to be significantly scaled back. Housing, a subject that painfully all of you are aware of today. This starts with a fallacy that any loan to real estate is a good loan. For some reason, that's our belief. You could have turned on any cable channel, and at 2 in the morning, they told you how to make $1 million. You don't put any money down, the government loans you 100%, you have no risk, it's non-recourse, and the price of a home only goes up. Well, let's take a look at what the facts are. This is a look at the last 120 years in America. If you look at this, you will see that a price of a home has gone down 63 years and it's gone up 57 years. So the idea that your home is an investment rather than a home you live in and raise your children in, and that you should borrow as much money, is not based on any facts. What has been the benefit? And we've done a lot of work in America of trying to say that it was this person's fault or that person's fault or it was the other issue. Almost all of the financial problems in America in the last 40 years can be traced to this. Every single major financial institution in Texas did not succeed in the 1980s as an independent institution. Most of the AAA financial institutions in 1980 were in Texas. The price of single-family homes in Houston went down 40%. And prime mortgages could not protect the banks at that time. Do we have more home ownership in this country? No, we don't. Other countries have more home ownership with recourse mortgages. And just imagine, what's happened to middle-class America. This dream has turned into a nightmare. What is the increase in domestic violence, divorce, other issues? By getting people to buy bigger homes. The size of a middle-class family home in the United States increased by 40%, from 1,500 to 2,500 square feet. Living farther away from where you work, spending less time with your family, more money on natural resources, non-recourse mortgages. The rest of the world is laughing at America. There's not one country left in the world that's doing this. And we are continuing to do it today. It's cost us trillions of dollars But that is the small cost. The real cost can be seen in middle-class America. Let's take a look at how middle-class America has changed its utility curve. 11 countries in Asia. The number one thing that they spend their money on is food, 23%. The number two thing they spend their money on is education. That's not private school, that's tutoring. That's supplemental education. That's 55% of the kids in China going to English language schools after they go or before they go to Chinese schools. They spend 10% on housing, and they spend 6% on transportation. So in Asia, they're spending 16%, 1/6 of middle-class family income on their house and their car. In the United States, we're spending 51% of middle-class monies going for housing and for transportation. Why do we have so many problems with nutrition, etc.? Because your house is 2.5 times more important than the food you eat with your family. And we spend, in this country, 16 times as much on our house, or 9 times as much on transportation as we do on the tutoring or supplemental education of our children. There is not one country in Asia where the parents and the family have assumed that the state will do everything for the education of their children. Not one. They take responsibility in addition to the state for the education of their children. So the idea that you should be diverting your money into a bigger house. The average house and per square foot in the United States today is 3 to 9 times per square foot for what a person has in Asia. Now, we're bigger than most of those people, but not 9 times. Not 9 times bigger. And so this has been the major casualty. It isn't the financial disasters of the 80s and recently. It's really convincing the middle-class family that they don't need responsibility for their health, for the education of their children, how big your car is, how big your house is, how far you live. That's what's important. And that's the only way you're going to make money. 3, entitlements. It's an issue we all understand well. As you fully well know, and we heard an impassioned plea today related to Social Security. Social Security was not a big problem. Why? When it was first introduced, life expectancy was 61.7, and it started at 62. So it wasn't a big issue at that point in time. Now today, life expectancy has gone to 78. And let's just take a look at what's occurred in France. In France, as life expectancy, as the rest of the world, for men and women went up, their retirement age went down. For the men in the room, if you look at insurance policies today, the probability of a 72-year-old man dying in the next year today is the same as it was for a 55-year-old man in 1975. The world has changed. I'm still sorry to report that a woman at 72 is still similar to the health of a man at 67. So we still have a little ways to go. Let's take a look at a quiz. So the U.S. government told us in 1967 that U.S. government spending on Medicare would grow 7 times by 1990. What do you believe was the real number? Was it 10 times, 23, 37, 44, 61? So the government budgets and estimates were, we're going to prepare for a growth of 7 times. The answer is it grew 61-fold. So the government was off by 8 to 9-fold. And so today, where it's difficult to generate a rate of return, people are living longer, etc., we need to focus on this issue. President Kennedy said, "We will bear any burden," in his inaugural address. We will bear any burden to protect the future of the United States of America? Have we asked our citizens to bear any burden yet? Are they willing to have cars that get higher gas mileage? We don't know what our sacrifice is yet. Education, I think we ought to just go back and take a look at this little report, A Nation at Risk. It was published in 1983, so it was published almost 30 years ago. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might view it as an act of war. 1983. We really haven't made much progress since then, if we look at what the results are and the studies that have shown as to what's occurred. Of all fourth graders in America, only 1/3 of them are able to read a page proficiently. So if the future of any country, city, is in your classroom, you have a challenge. China's growth started in their classrooms 30 years ago with a commitment. Our studies at the Milken Institute show there are plenty of jobs. 123 million jobs, high-skilled jobs are being available. Our problem right now is there's only 50 million Americans qualified for those jobs. You understand the issue. How are we going to bridge this gap? 73 million. How many of those are going overseas at this time? Let's just take a look at what China is. Middle-class families in China spend 50% more of their income on tutoring one child than on housing. Their future is the education of their children. 55% send their kids to English language schools today. Mayor Bradley, our good friend here, stated that it was a caring teacher that took a liking to him. He noticed the potential and wanted to help shape it. And so that is why we all understand we have not had a president that wasn't the education president. We just haven't been able to improve what we're doing. We give awards to everybody. You got to see the Grammy Museum, I think, this week, right near us here. And there's many awards given out. We give many achievement awards for sports, for athletes. The president brings, the winning athletic teams to the White House. We've reinforced in the public that these are our stars, these are our role models, these are the superstars. If you go to Singapore, what do they have up in Singapore? They're A+ scholars. You can see their posters. That is who they're talking about. Who are these individuals, etc. So at our foundation, I think many of you had a chance to attend some of these awards. We now have 2,500 winners in America throughout the country that we have brought there. And it isn't just the winners as examples to the profession. It is the thousands of kids that see it that day that a teacher and those movie cameras and those television cameras were there for that time. And so I would really suggest each of you try to find those educators in your communities that you can hold out for role models for kids. There's 3 million job openings in the next decade in education, 440 in the professional basketball leagues. So if those kids are vying for those jobs, there aren't going to be as many opportunities from that standpoint. Immigration, I view this more as invest in America. Immigration's a difficult issue, but not at the high end. Highly skilled, entrepreneurial, educated people, immigrants, have been the future of this country. There's a man named Philip Yo in Singapore. He's paid $3 million a year after tax to travel the world to get the best and brightest to move to Singapore. That's his job. We have one person with us today, who representative of his family, Dominic, who's going to talk to you in a few minutes, but we can just look and think about who some of these people are and what they've come from. Our current conductor at the LA Philharmonic from Venezuela, Albert Einstein from Germany, Jerry Yang from Taiwan, Google from Russia, etc. Let's take a look at our challenges. 1/3 of all doctoral students in the U.S. were not born in the United States. It used to be 10%. It's now 1/3. 84% of all doctorates for students who weren't born here are in engineering and science. Half of all the scientists and engineers now in Silicon Valley were not born in the United States. 15% of all these companies you read about that are being created, the CEO was born in India, and 13% was either born in Taiwan or China. Imagine what it would be if we created a program that let millions of the world's best and brightest come here, go to school, and stay, and create tens of millions of jobs. And people spend their money buying products here. Ross Duvall, who's with me from the Milken Institute, who's our expert on regional studies, has a student who's staying with him from China. What did he do when he landed at LAX yesterday? The first thing he asked is, can he go to an Apple store? It's a lot cheaper to buy his products here than in China. 12 years old to go buy his iPads here. Students, why is it important? Take a look. Where they start a job is where they go to school. I don't want you to ever underestimate the importance of a university or a college in your towns. They last longer than governments do. But you can see here in California, 69% of the kids who go to school here, if we would let them stay, start. Lastly, health. It's been a big issue and a big discussion last year. This is a look at health. Last year, the bill was focused on cost. The only way to reduce healthcare cost is prevention or cure. But the talk last year and the year before all relates to cost. You can't solve a problem. Now, what have we discovered? We discovered that 70% of all healthcare cost is lifestyle related. So yes, we have challenges in these other areas, but here it's not heredity, and we now know scientifically that you can change your genes. So even what your parents and your ancestors gave you, you can actually change those by what you eat, what you exercise, etc. It's been a difficult thing to do. I've tried to figure out why I've been so unsuccessful in the last 15, 16 years getting this point across. One, you know you can't lecture people. They have to decide on their own. The other thing we discovered is, until recently, the #1 spokesperson for cigarettes and other products was actually doctors. I'm going to show you just a 1-minute look at many of the commercials that ran in this country.
Daily round of calls, you'll find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with it. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" Once again, the brand named most was Camel. Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
So here's a quick look at America in 1991. This was America in 1991. We did not really have this issue in America. Obesity was not an issue in America. Louisiana, obviously, some of those recipes in New Orleans, Mississippi, West Virginia, and Michigan. And you'll see only half of Michigan had this issue. That was America in 1991. Less than 15% of the people really had this issue. Let's take a look at America in 2009. every single state in America in 2009 not only is over 15%, some of them are over 30%, and most of them are between 25 and 30%. This issue in America is only 20 years old. What did it cost America? What? The blue, over 15%. So let's go back one slide. Over 15% was 4 states. Today, the entire country, with some over 30. 7-year-olds weighing over 100 pounds has an increase tenfold in America. 12-year-olds weighing over 200 pounds has an increase tenfold in America. You might not know this, but there wasn't even a football player in the National Football League that weighed over 300 pounds. Today, there's more than 400 of them that weigh over 300 pounds. Now, California leads in a lot of areas, but I wanted to show you a picture that would never happen in Los Angeles, so I showed it from Orange County. Here's another picture from Orange County. So, okay, so I've put out cookbooks. Let's take a look at the U.S. Army and just what's happened in the military. Between 1995 and 2008, the proportion, and this is 13 years, and the U.S. Army recruits that failed their physicals because they were too much overweight increased 70%. 70%. What did it cost America, just the change in weight? So if we weighed the same as we did in 1991, whatever we weighed, a 30-year-old man, a 40-year-old woman, whatever it might be, it has cost the United States $1 trillion. So he asked, where did your money go? Your money went because we just took a look in a work done by Ross Duvall, published on Unhealthy America, just looked at 7 chronic diseases: diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, stroke, cancer, and you can increase your probability of getting all these diseases just by gaining weight. And so if we could return, if Americans said, okay, we're willing to, if it was good enough in 91 for the average person my height to weigh 170, I'm going to weigh 170. The country would get a $1 trillion benefit. There's a lot of work coming down the pike, but I want to just mention to you another challenge that not all of you have felt directly, but is affecting you all indirectly. 50% of all economic growth in the world in the last 200 years has come from sanitation or medical research. So we've talked about prevention. Just by returning to the level of weight, we can save $1 trillion, increase productivity, reduce absenteeism, etc. But can we actually eliminate disease? In the 1950s, they were talking about polio costing the United States $100 billion a year. They were off by 99.9% because we had a solution for polio, a vaccine. Today, the companies that have the lowest valuations in America are our medical research companies. We've lost 300,000 jobs. Energy, and many of these areas in this next century are going to be related to biology. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you announced you're stopping medical research and you're going to go into the diaper business, you're going to make lipstick, carbonated drinks, your stock goes up. So the value of a company making potato chips is worth 50 to 100% more in America today than a company who's trying to find a cure for a disease. And this is one of our great challenges. In closing, Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that does. You fully understand you have responsibility as mayors. The world is going to continue to become more urban and more people are going to move to the cities. The jobs are going to be created in these cities. How you lead and what direction you take is going to determine the future of your city and the future of our country, and whether the United States plays an important role in this century or not. I believe it's essential that the United States play this role, but we actually have to show leadership, certainty, and direction, and we have to attract the best and brightest the world has, and there is no future for any country if you can't find in your elementary, middle, and high schools. Thank you very much.
Wow.